Hi, a while ago I made a video titled Value of Consistency, in which I tried to analyze, among other things, the mechanic of Stancebreak in Elden Ring, and how consistently, or rather inconsistently, it applies across the boss pool of the base game. And it's finally time to do the same thing for the DLC, and see what changed in the design philosophy. One of the topics I covered in that video were attacks that ignore iframes, notably by the final boss of Dark Souls 3. Funnily enough, the final boss of this DLC
Somehow Palpatine returned.
also has a similar issue, so we might as well get it out of the way first. Once again, it is a juggle attack, but if in Dark Souls 3 you could reproduce this behavior reliably, here it only ignores your iframes sometimes. And in my initial testing, even when explicitly looking for this interaction, I missed it, and only learned about it from this video. The reason I missed it is because, as it turns out, SotE actually tried to avoid the event where an attack would ignore your dodge iframes. Even if the issue is of their own making, there was an attempt to fix it. And that shows recognition that attacks which ignore iframes are probably a bad thing and should be avoided. So why did that attempt fail? The way the developers went about creating a juggle attack this time is that the iframe ignoring property is still there, but it seems that it only exists in this section of the animation, which, if you got hit by the launch, would be the moment the swords connect with your body in the air, but not if you're on the ground. It is a relatively decent workaround, but it doesn't explain why you sometimes still get hit through iframes. And here I have to give credit to this comment under the video I just mentioned, as this is the first explanation that I have seen. It all has to do with uneven terrain. While the arena is mostly flat, there are still small peaks and valleys. And if you stand on a peak while Radahn stands in a valley, you end up at roughly the same height relative to Radahn that you would be if you got launched, which results in you taking damage. The most amusing part is that this is a solved issue. In this very DLC there is another juggle attack, Rellana Twin Moons. While it is intended for you to jump over it, it is completely dodgeable just by rolling. The relative height thing is not an issue here either, and yet it is able to function as a juggle attack. It seems to ignore the iframes only of the knock-up animation, as forcing a launch with a knock-back animation instead allows you to ignore the damage from the attack. There is also another interesting interaction with Rellana's Twin Moons. You can avoid the damage by jumping, yes, but you can also use certain attacks that flag you as jumping. One of those being the player version of Rellana's Twin Moons. And the irony here is that while you will ignore the damage based on the hard-coded properties of the attacks, Rellana can still get clipped by the spherical hitbox, which makes using this spell against itself pretty much the most efficient way to deal with it. So have fun in New Game Plus. Another property of this attack is that it destroys incoming projectiles, which is actually not a complaint. Well, almost, as this exact feature is shared by Rellana during her full moon attack, and the player version of both spells. The almost not a complaint part is the fact that the player version only destroys magic projectiles, but boss version destroys all projectiles. But again, it is consistent with Rellana's behavior. So this continuity is still cool to see. You know what other continuity would have been cool to see? Mohg's shackle being able to stun Concert Radahn, because, you know, it's Mohg's body. Anyway, since we're back to the topic of Radahn, where was I? So the boss can ignore your iframes. Hopefully that same boss doesn't have iframes of his own arbitrarily applied to one of his attacks. Oh, he does. During this attack, he just loses his hitbox. There's not really much to add here, he's just completely intangible for no apparent reason. While an enemy that is supposed to actually be intangible, or should I say untouchable, will take damage from things like Black Flame, Destined Death, and Night Maiden's Mist, and can be killed without dispelling untouchability effect the intended way. All because a faint visual effect has to play when you hit them, which ironically means that the enemy still has to register hits. The developers just forgot to make the enemy actually invulnerable to everything. So the aging Untouchable doesn't actually get to be untouchable, but Radahn does. And so does Commander Gaius during his infamous charge. This untouchability state ends when the charge reaches his target and transitions into the follow-up animation. However, Gaius' charge is infamous for a different reason. The fact that it feels very inconsistently difficult to dodge by rolling. And that feeling is completely justified, because this charge, in addition to the head hitbox, also spawns hitboxes on the ground that are not attached to Gaius himself. I have to give credit to this video, as this is how I learned about these hitboxes.
The problem with that is in one frame, this is the total distance your roll needs to clear, and then in the next frame, the tailing capsule despawns, and now it's only this distance your roll needs to clear.
So you can't reliably roll the charge and have to find alternate ways of avoiding it, and because of the untouchability, you also have no chance of stopping the charge by Stancebreak. Even though Falling Star Beasts have a unique mechanic which specifically allows players to stop their charges by hitting the beasts in the head hard enough. That mechanic, by the way, functions independently of the Poise meter, and simply plays Stancebreak sound as it fulfills a similar role. But even without a unique mechanic, interrupting a charge with Stancebreak is possible with Skip the Avatar in the second phase. However, if you try to Stancebreak the Avatar during this attack, you might expect that it will prevent the projectile waves from spawning, at the very least every wave beyond the first. But no, all of them spawn, eating away at the precious time before the boss gets up from the critical state, as well as still being a damage threat. Certain area of effect attacks persisting even though the boss gets interrupted was an already frequent enough occurrence even in the base game. And the DLC unfortunately does not make an improvement on this front. And many bosses still have delayed damage effects that happen despite the boss no longer performing the action that is supposed to trigger those effects. Notable exception being Messmer, his second phase attack that summons snakes to attack the player, if interrupted early enough, will not summon any more snakes beyond the first one, which seems to be called immediately upon the animation start and simply arrives with a small delay. Likewise, if stands broken during the final section of Messmer's assault, he will not trigger the spear eruption. So Messmer definitely earns some points here. Or, rather, he doesn't lose any points, because this is the expected behavior that other bosses don't follow. However, there is still a strange issue with Messmer. During the attacks that transform him into a snake, his health cannot be reduced below 1, meaning that he is effectively unkillable in that state. But what is really strange about this is that he's not really unkillable, because after he transforms back, his health will immediately drop from 1 to 0 by itself, and he will die. So at most, it only allows him to finish the snake attack, and simply delays your victory a little bit. Compare this to Malenia, who does not go into phase 2 if the final bit of damage is dealt with a riposte or a status effect, which gives her an opportunity to heal back and or kill you. With that in mind, I'm not sure if I would consider Messmer's situation to be a problem to a meaningful degree. I would, however, consider it for his long flying attacks also grant him immortality, and this time you do have to finish off that 1 HP by yourself. As such, it has a chance of robbing you of your hard-earned victory. Even though the chance might not be high, the game's systems do provide enough of a foundation for you to try to make Hawkeye Goth proud by shooting a dragon from the sky. But not this one. These same attacks also feature our old friend Stancebreak immunity, where if you bring his Poise below 0, it will start regenerating, and you will lose your progress. But there is actually an important adjustment compared to the form of Stancebreak immunity that we are familiar with from the base game. That old form is only present in Rellana during Carian Sovereignty, and in Midra during the Frenzy Dive Bomb. We'll come back to the attack later. That adjustment is the fact that even if the Poise reset timer runs out while the boss has active Stancebreak immunity, Poise will not start regenerating until the immunity ends, which adds a certain grace period for attacks that tend to move the boss out of player's reach for an extended period of time. This approach is combined with the other form of Stancebreak immunity from the base game, which is the complete immunity to Poise damage in the first place. This does work as a sort of a compromise that slightly shifts the balance back towards an average player, who will benefit from not losing Stancebreak progress, while the bosses do their long attacks created with primarily spectacle in mind. And while it's worth remembering that this is still a deviation from the base mechanic, it is a better implementation of the immunity. And the type of attacks that it applies to also seems to be more consistent than in base game. So it is an improvement, even though there are still some attacks that, according to this pattern, you would expect to have immunity, but are actually interruptible. Most surprising one being the startup of Radahn's Metyr, because the Starscourge version is immune, but the Concert version is not. And since we're back to the topic of Radahn, while he doesn't have any attacks with Stancebreak immunity, he subverts the Poise mechanic in a different way. See, the duration of the Poise reset timer actually correlates directly with the Poise amount. For example, Malenia, with her 80 Poise, starts regenerating it after 6 seconds of not being hit. While for Godfrey, who has 120 Poise, the timer is instead 9 seconds. But Consort Radahn starts regenerating Poise after 6 seconds, despite having 120 Poise. The base game also had exceptions to that rule, like Crystallians, who don't regenerate Poise at all because of their unique Stancebreak and stagger mechanics. And the other exceptions are, funnily enough, the enemy that is used as a tutorial for Stancebreak and the subsequent Soldier of Godric, who both regenerate their Poise instantly without any delay created by the reset timer. But, while it is ironic that the very enemy that is meant to teach the player how the mechanic works does not follow that mechanic, it is done for a decent reason, to serve as an incentive to try charged or jump attacks with a higher bursts of Poise damage, and therefore to teach the player that those attacks have a higher Stancebreak potential. Unfortunately, this DLC has an enemy that throws the whole concept of higher Stancebreak potential out of the window. I'm talking about the Furnace Golems. Furnace Golems have 300 Poise, which first of all regenerates constantly with no delay, and second, has nothing to do with their Stancebreak. You could hit them with the highest Poise damage attacks in the game. You could bring their Poise below 0 and still not break them. Poise damage just does not matter. What matters here is the regular damage. Just raw damage output, regardless of the associated Poise damage. Oh, and as a side note, if you get an itch to feel clever and use Black Flame or Destined Death, aka % max health damage, against this high max health target, it will not work. Another problematic thing is the dodgeability, or more specifically, jumpability of the Golem's stomp attacks. For whatever reason, a giant explosion generated by the stomp has a flag that allows you to avoid the damage by jumping. And if we accept that, alright, this is how these explosions work, then we have another problem, because the explosion from the jumping double stomp does not have that flag, and you will take damage if you try to jump it. This is a massive issue of both clarity and consistency that is unfortunately quite frequent. Bayle has the exact same problem where one of his explosions is jumpable and the other is not. Also, Radahn has a stomp with a ground shockwave that looks identical to Godfrey's stomps. And while you still can technically jump over Radahn's shockwaves, they do not have the same jumpable attack flag that Godfrey's stomps do. Another issue with both consistency and clarity is the lightning shockwave in the water in Ancient Dragon Senessax arena. The base game already had occasional issues with lightning and water, but this dragon takes it to the next level. Normally, if you fire a lightning projectile into the water, it creates shockwaves. If they reach ground before their maximum radius, they disappear. And obviously hitting the ground does nothing. But not for Senessax, who spawns the shockwaves even if the lightning doesn't touch water. It's just a delayed explosion that is built into the attack. The shockwaves here are actually generated by firing these invisible projectiles, which, if you fight on this slope, will fly a lot further than you might expect. And it's highly unlikely that you would ever figure out what is actually happening without pulling the camera back. Just like it is unlikely that you would ever figure out what is happening in Metyr's fight during her double laser attack. From the normal point of view, it is very difficult to notice that this attack actually has tracking. What this means is that on top of the lasers spinning around Metyr's body, her body itself also rotates as you move around her. So the angular velocities get added together, which results in the area of effect effectively speeding up if you try to run counterclockwise, or slowing down if you try to dodge through the laser. If we disable enemy AI, we can test how the attack would function without the tracking. Interestingly enough, dodging through the laser is still not a viable tactic, even though it does become possible with a frame-perfect Bloodhound step. So that's not what the tracking steals from you. Not really. The real difference is that without tracking, it becomes possible to run counterclockwise away from the laser, long enough that it reaches the point in the animation where it starts to move up, opening a gap between the laser and the storm. But as I said, with AI and tracking enabled, that is impossible, because the laser will catch up to you as if you were not moving. Your only hope of dodging the attack is to use Vow of the Indomitable or Raptor of the Mists after gaining enough distance from the boss, so that you're only dodging the shockwave and not the laser itself. Otherwise, this can happen. It is also problematic if you are in melee range, because the storm under the boss appears extremely quickly. While it is technically possible to run and roll from the storm, both your reaction to the attack startup and the roll timing have to be pretty much frame perfect. Essentially, if you want to reliably avoid this attack with just the baseline toolkit of the player character, you cannot. Even Waterfowl was technically dodgeable on reaction by any player with just a bit of skill and an unhealthy dose of tracking abuse. But as far as I'm aware, the only reliable method of dodging Metyr's double laser from point blank on reaction with normal human reaction time is the one that I found, which is chaining iframes from Miriam's vanishing into Bloodhound's step. And because of how unintuitive the attack is, as well as the fact that Miriam's vanishing is a build-specific tool, it essentially means that this is one of the only attacks in the game that can be considered unavoidable for the majority of players. But just because an attack is intuitive and easy to dodge, doesn't mean it is exempt from criticism. It is fairly obvious what you're supposed to do here, isn't it? Run under the boss, mess up his tracking, and create distance. But have you actually tried iframing through the attack? Maybe you did try, and you blamed yourself for a mistimed roll. But no, it was not your fault, because this attack ignores your iframes. And blocking. The only way to dodge it is by leaving the hitbox entirely, or using Raptor of the Mists, because it does not function on iframes. And since this isn't a juggle attack, or any sort of combo for that matter, there is no reason why this specific attack should ignore iframes. Not even a bad reason, just none. No reason, no excuse. Why? And to make matters worse, it is also bugged, and sometimes it looks like Midra will cancel the recovery animation of this attack. But it isn't actually animation cancelling. Not intentional at least. The reason is uneven terrain, again. Except this time, the difference in elevation causes Midra to stumble upon landing sometimes, and immediately proceed to some other attack. Both of those facts I managed to miss in my first playthrough, which led to Midra being my favorite boss of the DLC. Not anymore.
We had a good thing, you stupid son of a bitch. We had everything we needed. It all ran like clockwork. It was perfect. But no, you just had to blow it up. You and your...
Forgive me, dearest Nanaya.
Oh well, I think that's enough of that for today. If you enjoy the kind of discussion videos like this generate, consider joining my Discord server. You'll get to see some of the process that goes into making these videos, and maybe even participate if I learn something from you. Next video will probably be a similar coverage of Elden Ring Night Train mechanics. After that, who knows? For now, take care, and I'll see you when I see you.